I've always thought of myself as someone who notices the little things. I pick up on the subtlest changes in tone, the way someone shifts in their chair when they're uncomfortable, or the almost imperceptible pause before they speak. But now, sitting alone in the dim glow of the kitchen light, I realized just how blind I'd been to Evelyn's changes. 9 years of marriage had created a rhythm between us, a partnership I believed was unshakable. Evelyn was magnetic, effortlessly drawing people toward her. She could light up a room with her presence, her laughter infectious and her smile disarming. It was one of the things I loved most about her. But over the past few months, that light seemed dimmer. Or maybe, I thought bitterly, it simply wasn't shining in my direction anymore. It started with the small things. She'd pause mid-conversation, her eyes flickering to her phone with a brief, nervous smile. Her laugh, once so easy, had a faint hesitancy to it now. And then there were the late nights at work. At first, I didn't think much of it. Evelyn was a senior project manager at an ad agency, a demanding job, no doubt. Deadlines came and went, and I'd gotten used to her hurried texts. Running late, don't wait up. But the texts had become more frequent, the hours later, and the explanations thinner. One evening, she came home just past midnight. I was on the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly, waiting. The sound of her heels on the hardwood floor startled me, and I looked up as she entered the room. Her smile was rushed, her coat slung over her shoulder. "Hey, sorry about that. We're under so much pressure with this new campaign." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "You must be exhausted." She waved it off, heading toward the kitchen. "Deadlines, you know how it is." I watched her disappear down the hallway, something twisting in my gut. There was nothing particularly damning about her words, but her tone felt off, distant. The next morning, as I was gathering laundry, a slip of paper fell out of her purse. I bent down, picking it up, and froze. It was a receipt from the Avalon, an upscale restaurant downtown. The date was the night before. I stared at it for a moment, my mind racing. We hadn't been to the Avalon together in over a year. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was a business dinner. Maybe it was something completely innocent. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and no matter how much I tried to shake them, they refused to budge. Unsure of what to do, I reached out to Marcus. He was an old friend, someone I hadn't seen much since our college days, but still trusted implicitly. After leaving the military, Marcus had become a private investigator. If anyone could help me figure out what was going on, it was him. We met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Marcus, with his short-cropped hair and calm, steady demeanor, listened intently as I laid out my concerns. "So, you think she's cheating?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice low. "I don't want to believe it, Marcus. But something's wrong. I can feel it." He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a gut feeling, and those are hard to ignore. But before you jump to conclusions, let's find out the truth." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "And what if the truth is exactly what I'm afraid of?" Marcus gave me a sympathetic look. "Then you deal with it one step at a time. But you deserve to know." His calm assurance gave me a sliver of solace. I didn't want to believe Evelyn was capable of betrayal, but I needed to know for certain. That evening, as I sat in the quiet of our bedroom, I glanced over at Evelyn's side of the bed. Her phone was charging on the nightstand, face down as always. She was in the shower, humming softly, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I thought about the receipt, about her distracted tone and her late nights. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was letting my gut take me to the worst possible conclusion. But what if he wasn't? As the water shut off and Evelyn stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around her, she smiled at me, the kind of smile that once felt like home. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I forced a smile in return. "Yeah, everything's fine." But it wasn't, and deep down I think she knew it too. When Marcus handed me the folder, I didn't open it right away. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, gripping the edges of the thick paper, my knuckles turning white. The weight of it was heavier than I expected, as though it carried not just photographs but the undeniable truth I had been dreading. I stared at it for a long time, letting the soft hum of the engine fill the silence. Finally, I took a deep breath, opened the folder, and let the truth hit me. The first picture was innocuous enough. Evelyn sitting at an outdoor cafe, smiling. But the man across from her wasn't me. He leaned toward her, his hand resting casually on the table. In the next photo, they were walking side by side, their laughter clear even in the stillness of the image. I flipped through more. A dimly lit restaurant, their faces close, her hand brushing his arm. Then, the one that made my stomach drop, a hotel lobby, the two of them walking in together, her arm looped through his. The man's name was Lucas, one of her co-workers. Marcus had confirmed it, along with details I hadn't asked for but now couldn't ignore. Lucas was divorced, no kids, and had a reputation in his office for being charming. Too charming. As I stared at the images, the air in the car felt heavier. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the unraveling of a life I thought I understood. But beneath the anger and the hurt, a new emotion took root. Determination. That night, Evelyn came home as usual, her smile warm but thin, her excuses rehearsed. Long day, I asked, forcing my tone to stay even. The longest, she sighed, slipping off her shoes and heading to the kitchen. We're juggling so many campaigns right now, I can barely keep track. I watched her as she moved through the space, her phone never leaving her hand. There it was again, that faint hesitation before she answered a question. The way her gaze lingered on her screen as though waiting for something or someone. Her laughter when she spoke to me felt hollow, like a performance she couldn't quite sell. The next day I met Marcus again. This time he didn't just have photographs, he had a story. You were right to come to me, Adam, he said, sliding a second folder across the table. Lucas isn't just a guy hitting on your wife. He's involved in something bigger. I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Bank statements, company records, and a trail of transactions that painted a disturbing picture. Lucas has been funneling money into a shell company, Marcus explained. He's skimming from his clients, using fake invoices to pad his accounts. And here's where it gets interesting. One of those accounts is tied to Evelyn's name. What? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. It's in her name, Marcus confirmed. But there's no evidence yet that she knows about it. Could be Lucas using her as a front, or she could be complicit. Either way, she's tangled up in this. The thought of Evelyn being part of something illegal hit me harder than the affair itself. I had questions, too many to count, and no way to ask them without tipping her off. If she didn't know what Lucas was doing, confronting her might only make things worse. And if she did know, I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on Marcus's findings. Lucas's shell company had been active for nearly a year, and his transactions showed a pattern of targeting vulnerable clients, overcharging them, and rerouting the funds to untraceable accounts. How do we proceed? I asked, my tone resolute. You need to be careful, Marcus said. If Evelyn's in on this, you need proof before you act. And if she's not, you might still need to protect her. That evening, I sat in my office at home, staring at the photographs and documents Marcus had given me. The temptation to confront Evelyn was strong, but something held me back. Her behavior, as suspicious as it was, didn't scream guilt. There were moments when her smiles felt genuine, when her affection seemed real. But then there were the late nights, the excuses, the lies. I couldn't let my emotions dictate my actions. If Lucas was pulling her into something dangerous, I needed to protect her, even if she had betrayed me. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention. Evelyn didn't know I'd seen the photos or that Marcus was digging into her coworker's past. I watched her carefully, noting every glance at her phone, every rushed explanation about her schedule. I noticed how she seemed nervous when she received texts at odd hours, how her hand lingered on her phone as though deciding whether to reply. One evening, I casually mentioned Lucas's name. How's Lucas doing? I asked, keeping my tone light. Evelyn froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. He's fine. Busy, like the rest of us. Her answer was quick, rehearsed. As the days went on, Marcus fed me more details about Lucas's operation. He had targeted several coworkers before Evelyn, convincing them to help him with harmless financial tasks before dragging them deeper into his schemes. Some realized too late what they'd gotten into. What's his end game? I asked Marcus during one of our meetings. Money and leverage, he replied. If Evelyn's involved, she might not even know how bad this is. Lucas is good at manipulation. He builds trust, then uses it to control people. The thought made my blood boil. If Lucas was using Evelyn, I needed to stop him before he destroyed her life, and mine. For now, I had to stay quiet, observing and gathering evidence. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about me or my marriage anymore. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The house was quiet as I parked in the driveway, but something felt off. The faint glow of the dining room lights spilled through the curtains, and I could make out two figures inside. Evelyn's posture was unmistakable, tense, arms crossed, leaning slightly against the table. The second figure was seated, casually at ease, their movements unfamiliar. I stepped through the front door, calling out, "Evelyn? I'm home." Her voice came from the dining room, strained but steady. "In here." As I walked into the room, my breath caught. There he was, Lucas, sitting at my dining table, a mug of tea in his hand, his posture so relaxed it bordered on arrogance. He looked up and smiled as if we were old friends. "Ah, Adam. Finally, we meet." The gall of it stunned me, but I kept my expression neutral. "And you are?" Lucas extended a hand, his smile unwavering. "Lucas, Evelyn's coworker. She's mentioned you." I didn't take his hand. "Funny, she hasn't mentioned you much." His grin faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Well, we've been working closely on a few campaigns. Late nights, deadlines, you know how it is." I turned to Evelyn, who was staring at the floor, her arms folded tightly. "Late nights?" I repeated, my voice calm but sharp. "I guess that explains a lot." Her head snapped up, but she didn't meet my eyes. "Lucas just dropped by to go over some last-minute details for a project." I didn't think it was a big deal. Lucas chimed in, his tone light. "I hope I'm not intruding. Evelyn said you wouldn't mind." The air in the room felt suffocating, but I forced myself to stay composed. I sat across from Lucas, folding my hands on the table. "Well, Lucas, you seem to be making yourself at home." He laughed, the sound grating. "I guess I do have a knack for that." His confidence was infuriating, but it also told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a man who respected boundaries. This was someone who saw me as an obstacle already defeated. Evelyn's silence was deafening. Each second she refused to speak, cutting deeper than anything Lucas could say. When Lucas finally left, I stood in the doorway, watching as he strolled to his car with infuriating nonchalance. Evelyn lingered in the living room, her arms wrapped around herself. I closed the door and turned to her, my composure cracking slightly. "Care to explain why he's sitting in my dining room like he owns the place?" "It's not what you think," she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then why don't you tell me what it is?" I replied, keeping my tone measured. She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "He's just a coworker. We were working late and—" "Stop!" I interrupted. "I don't need more excuses. I've seen the way you act when he's around. I've seen the receipts, the phone calls, the late nights." Her mouth opened, then closed again, as though she couldn't find the words to defend herself. I wanted to press further, to demand the truth, but I held back. Evelyn's vague responses only confirmed what I already knew. She was tangled in something far bigger than just an affair. Confronting her directly wouldn't get me the answers I needed. That night, as she lay in bed pretending to sleep, I sat in my office, staring at the files Marcus had sent over. Lucas wasn't just a liar, he was a criminal. His shell company had siphoned tens of thousands from unsuspecting clients, and Evelyn's name was still tied to one of the accounts. Whether she was complicit or simply naive didn't matter anymore. What mattered was stopping Lucas before he dragged her down with him. Marcus called the next morning, his voice grim but determined. "I've got more on Lucas," he said. "His operation is bigger than we thought. He's targeting vulnerable clients, forging contracts, and using people like Evelyn to cover his tracks." "What's the next step?" I asked, my voice steady. "We need to build a solid case. We've got enough to expose him, but it'll take coordination. This guy's slippery. If we don't nail every detail, he'll worm his way out. Then let's make sure he can't." Over the next week, I worked quietly, pretending everything at home was normal. Evelyn continued her late nights and hurried explanations, each one sharpening my resolve. Meanwhile, Marcus and I pieced together the final threads of Lucas's operation. Bank statements, fraudulent contracts, and testimonies from former coworkers painted a damning picture. Lucas thought he was untouchable, but his arrogance would be his downfall. One evening, as Evelyn sat across from me at dinner, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, her expression tightening for just a moment before she turned it face down. "Work again?" I asked casually, spearing a piece of chicken with my fork. "Yeah," she said, her tone clipped. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Must be a lot of pressure." "You have no idea," she replied, her eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away. I didn't respond, but inwardly, I made a decision. It was time to set things in motion. Lucas needed to understand that arrogance and deceit carried consequences. And Evelyn needed to see the truth before it was too late. By the time I was finished, neither of them would be able to deny the cost of their choices. The restaurant Lucas had chosen was the kind of place that catered to people who wanted to be seen. Chandeliers sparkled above pristine white tablecloths, and the low hum of conversation mixed with the soft clinking of silverware. Lucas had arrived first, predictably, sitting at a prime table near the center of the room, his posture exuding confidence. I walked in, carrying the folder tucked under my arm, and let my eyes scan the room briefly before approaching. Lucas spotted me and smiled, standing as if we were old friends. "Adam," he said, extending a hand. "Glad you could make it." I shook his hand, keeping my grip firm and my expression neutral. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, taking a seat across from him. He motioned to a waiter, ordering a bottle of wine without consulting me, and leaned back in his chair. "So, what's this business opportunity you mentioned? Evelyn said you're quite the entrepreneur." The mention of Evelyn made my jaw tighten, but I kept my composure. "We'll get to that," I said, setting the folder on the table but keeping my hand on it. "First, I want to get a sense of who I'm dealing with." Lucas chuckled, swirling the glass of water in front of him. "Well, you've got me here. What do you want to know?" His arrogance was palpable, and I let him bask in it for a moment, knowing what was coming next. "Let's talk about your business ventures," I said casually. "The consulting work, the shell companies." The shift in his demeanor was subtle but telling. His smile faltered for a split second before returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean." I slid the folder across the table, watching as his confidence cracked further. "Then maybe this will refresh your memory." Lucas opened the folder, his fingers tightening around the edges as he flipped through the documents. Bank statements, forged contracts, and a trail of fraudulent transactions that led straight to him, and to Evelyn's account. "You've been busy," I said, my tone calm but sharp. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you get this?" "That's not important," I replied. "What's important is what happens next." Lucas leaned back in his chair, trying to recover his composure. "This doesn't prove anything. You think you can come in here and threaten me? You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I said, my voice steady. "A man who uses charm and lies to manipulate people, who's been stealing from clients and dragging others into his mess. This is just the tip of the iceberg, Lucas. Imagine what happens when the full picture comes out." For the first time, Lucas's confidence wavered. He stared at the folder, his jaw tightening. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Two things," I said. "First, you cut ties with Evelyn. Completely. No calls, no texts, no excuses to see her. You're out of her life starting now. And second, you leave town, quietly.
No fanfare, no theatrics.
Just disappear. Lucas let out a hollow laugh. And if I don't? I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. If you don't, I'll make sure this goes public. The fraud, the accounts, everything. You'll lose your job, your reputation, and probably your freedom. He tried to argue, throwing out weak excuses about misunderstandings and exaggerations, but the evidence was undeniable. I stayed silent, letting him flail under the weight of the truth. Eventually, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Fine, he said. I'll go. But you should know, Evelyn. Stop. I interrupted, my tone cutting. This isn't about her. It's about you. And you're done. Lucas stared at me for a long moment before nodding, the last remnants of his arrogance crumbling. He pushed the folder back toward me and stood, adjusting his suit jacket. Enjoy your victory, Adam, he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. I watched him walk out, his steps no longer carrying the same self-assured swagger. As the door swung shut behind him, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about crushing Lucas under the weight of his own deceit, though that was a satisfying byproduct. It was about reclaiming control over my life, my choices, and the future I wanted to rebuild. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe again. It started small, the way most collapses do. A few unanswered texts from her friends, conversations that trailed off when she entered the room. I noticed Evelyn scrolling through her phone more often, her brow furrowing with each swipe. She was beginning to feel it. The invisible ripple spreading outward from Lucas's fall, the whispers of his schemes tainting anyone associated with him. The first real blow came one morning over breakfast. Evelyn opened a letter from the bank, her eyes scanning the page quickly before widening in panic. "What is this?" she muttered, her voice rising. I watched her from across the table, sipping my coffee. "Something wrong. They've frozen my account," she said, her voice shaking. "They think there's suspicious activity, transfers I didn't authorize." She looked up at me, her face pale. "Adam, I don't understand. What's happening?" I set my mug down and met her gaze evenly. "You should ask Lucas." The color drained from her face as my words landed. For a moment, she seemed frozen, caught between denial and realization. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone calm. "Lucas was using your name, Evelyn. He tied one of his shell accounts to you. I warned you he wasn't who you thought he was." Her hands trembled as she clutched the letter. "You knew? And you didn't tell me?" "I didn't tell you," I said evenly, "because you wouldn't have listened. You made it clear whose side you were on." She flinched at that, her lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and left the room without another word. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Evelyn paced the house, making call after call, her voice alternately pleading and demanding. I heard her trying to explain herself to her friends, to her bank, even to her employer. But the fallout was swift. Her social circle, once so vibrant, seemed to vanish overnight. The invitations stopped coming, the messages went unanswered. One evening, I passed her office and saw her sitting at her desk, her head in her hands. Papers were scattered across the surface, bank statements, legal notices, and correspondence from her work. She looked up as I entered, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what he was doing, Adam. I swear." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You chose him, Evelyn. You trusted him over me." Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she choked out. I didn't think." "That's exactly the problem," I said quietly. "You didn't think. You ignored every sign, every warning, because it was easier than facing the truth." For the next few days, Evelyn tried to make amends. She apologized constantly, her words tumbling out in a mix of regret and desperation. "I was stupid," she said more than once. "I should have seen what he was doing. Please, Adam, I need you to believe me." But her apologies felt hollow, her attempts at repair too little, too late. One evening, she sat across from me in the living room, her eyes red and swollen. "Can we fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Can we fix us?" I studied her for a long moment before responding. "That depends on you. But I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. You made choices, Evelyn. And this is the result." Her shoulders slumped, the weight of my words settling over her. She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. As the weeks went on, Evelyn's life continued to unravel. Her attempts to disentangle herself from Lucas's mess were met with roadblocks at every turn. The bank investigation dragged on. Her employer put her on leave, and her once glowing reputation was tarnished beyond repair. I watched it all unfold with a mix of detachment and sadness. I wanted to feel vindicated, to revel in her downfall. But instead, I felt only a quiet resignation. This wasn't just her failure, it was ours. And yet, as much as she tried to repair what had been broken, I couldn't let her avoid the consequences. She had to face them, just as I had faced the truth of her betrayal. One evening, as I sat in my office, Evelyn knocked softly on the door. "Can I come in?" I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from me. She sat down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try to make things right. For us." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Evelyn, making things right starts with you. I can't do that for you. You have to decide who you want to be and what kind of life you want to live. But I'm not going to make this easy for you." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time, she nodded. "I understand," she said softly. As she left the room, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not for our marriage, not yet, but for the possibility of rebuilding, whatever that might look like. Evelyn's collapse had been painful to watch, but it was necessary. Only in the wreckage of her choices could she begin to see the truth. The suitcase sat open on the bed, half filled with clothes and essentials. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of fabric as I folded shirts and tucked them neatly into the bag. Evelyn hadn't said a word since I started packing. I could feel her presence just outside the bedroom door, lingering in the hallway like a ghost haunting a life already gone. I paused, staring at a photograph on the dresser. It was taken years ago, back when everything felt simpler, when trust wasn't something I questioned, and betrayal was a concept I only read about in novels. We were smiling, our arms around each other, oblivious to the cracks that would eventually form. I slipped the photo face down in the drawer. The next morning, I stood by the front door, my bag resting at my feet. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. Evelyn sat on the couch, staring at the wall, her eyes red from crying. "Adam," she said, her voice trembling as she turned to me. "Please, don't do this." I met her gaze, my expression calm but resolute. "Evelyn, this isn't what I want, but it's what I need to do." She stood quickly, crossing the room to stand in front of me. Her hands clutched at the front of my jacket, her desperation spilling out in a torrent of words. "We can fix this. I know I messed up, but I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't leave." I gently pried her hands away, holding them in mine for a brief moment before letting them go. "Trust is the foundation of any relationship," I said, my voice steady. "You broke that, Evelyn, and now there's nothing left." Her tears fell freely as she pleaded with me, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "We can rebuild it. I know it won't be easy, but I love you, Adam. Doesn't that mean anything?" I took a deep breath, my own heart heavy. "Love isn't enough, Evelyn. Takes trust, honesty, and respect. And you didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself. You chose Lucas, you chose lies, and now I'm choosing to walk away." She shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached for me again. "Please," she whispered, "don't give up on us." My chest tightened, but I knew there was no turning back. "I gave us everything I had," I said quietly. "But there's nothing left to save." I picked up my bag and opened the door, pausing for a moment to look back at her. She stood there, a broken figure in the middle of the room, her tears falling silently now. "Goodbye, Evelyn," I said, stepping outside. As I closed the door behind me, the weight of the moment pressed down hard. But with every step I took toward my car, I felt something shift. As I drove away, I expected to feel regret, or anger, or bitterness. Instead, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The life we had shared was over, but for the first time in months, I could see the glimmer of a future not defined by lies and betrayal. This wasn't running away, it was moving forward. The road stretched out before me, wide and open, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The headlines were relentless in their coverage of Lucas's downfall. His fraudulent empire had finally crumbled under the weight of evidence, and the investigations exposed not only his financial crimes but the trail of deceit that marked his entire career. For a man who had built his life on charm and lies, there was no escape. His name became synonymous with greed and corruption, his reputation in tatters. Evelyn wasn't spared from the fallout. Though her involvement was minimal compared to Lucas's grander schemes, the association was enough to destroy what little stability she had left. Her bank accounts remained frozen pending investigations. Her social circle vanished as if overnight, and whispers of her complicity turned into outright disdain. For the first time in years, Evelyn was truly alone. She tried to reach out to me a few times. Calls I didn't answer, letters I didn't open. Each attempt felt like an echo of the life we once shared, but I knew better than to respond. Our story was over, and reopening old wounds wouldn't change anything. I'd seen her once by chance, weeks after I left. She was standing on the sidewalk outside a cafe, her phone pressed to her ear, her shoulders slumped. She looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of her choices had physically diminished her. I didn't stop to say hello. I just kept walking, letting her fade into the background of the city. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my own life. The days following my departure from Evelyn had been hard, filled with moments of doubt and pain. But slowly, those feelings gave way to something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I threw myself into my work, setting goals that had nothing to do with anyone but myself. I reconnected with old friends, the kind who didn't need explanations or apologies for my absence. And I took the time to rediscover the things that brought me joy. Long hikes in the woods, late nights reading novels, quiet mornings with coffee on the porch. Each day felt like a small step forward, a reminder that life didn't end with betrayal. Transformed. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I stood on my back porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands. The air was crisp, carrying with it the promise of a new season. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the love I'd once had for Evelyn, the trust that had been shattered, and the painful but necessary decision to walk away. For a long time, I'd carried the weight of betrayal like a stone in my chest, letting it define me. But now, as I stood there watching the world wake up, I felt something different. Closure. I didn't hate Evelyn. How could I? At one point, she had been my everything. But people change, and love doesn't always survive the choices we make. She had her path and I had mine. Our marriage hadn't been a failure, it had been a lesson. A turning point that forced me to confront who I was and what I wanted. The horizon stretched endlessly before me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of possibility. There was so much left to discover, so much left to build. The end of my marriage wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with healing, growth, and the quiet joy of rediscovering myself. The weight of betrayal had lifted, replaced by the clarity of a brighter future.